Thanks, Gordon. Thanks for the pretty good pronunciation of my name. Most submissions I do to conferences, I get rejected. I always think that it's because they don't know how to pronounce my name. And thanks to Brian for having me. So yeah, that's me. That's almost the name of the conference that you're at. It's only one letter off. So there's the obligatory about me slide, and I thought instead I'd do it about my wife. I've been working in security for 12 years, and throughout these years, my wife has been both my greatest supporter and my greatest critic. And it's fair to say I wouldn't have been here if it wasn't for her. And there's also the fact that she passed away this summer very suddenly, which is sad. But it's also, I think we're kind of conditioned to think that this is the end of the world, and it is not. And I'm here to show, well, I'm living the life now to show people that it's not the end of the world, that you can have a great life while keeping someone in memory. And yeah, so it's fair to say I wouldn't have been here if she hadn't passed away, because I decided to do a bit more traveling, and I arranged it with Brian, I think within a week after her death. And I'm very grateful to him for giving me this opportunity. Thank you. That's great. So I'm going to talk about spam. This is the very first spam message ever. It is not. This is the very first complaint about a spam message ever. It's from 1864 in the London Times, and someone complained about dentist spam sent via the electric telegraph, which was a fairly new thing back then. I don't know if it's really spam as we know it, but it was abusing mass communication system. So this is a very brief and somewhat accurate history of spam. So, okay, this is 1860s thing, but it really started in the late 1970s with the first electronic spam in an ARPANET, I think in 1978. Then, roughly in the 1980s, spam was just being impolite. It was a very small, friendly internet, and spam was just kind of breaking the informal rules. Then in the 1990s, spam became a nuisance. Especially in the second half of the 1990s, the internet started growing, and you started seeing things like Viagra spam and other kind of scam. Rolex spam, I think, was a big thing then already. This is also when the first spam filters started. So Spam Assassin goes back to the 1990s, as does Spamhaus. In the 2000s, spam became a threat. And firstly, for obvious reasons, spam started carrying malware, worms, viruses. There were email worms in the early 2000s, maybe a bit earlier even. And that was really bad. That suddenly malware could spread very fast over the internet, and spam was a carrying mechanism. But spam was also a threat because it suddenly seemed like email may not survive spam. Spam was growing very fast, and to the point that many people were predicting that email would just die, that it just wouldn't survive. And if you look at the statistics and look at the growth of spam around that time, then it made sense. It seemed like something we couldn't keep up, no matter how good your spam filter you wouldn't keep up. And then later on, we solved it. We more or less solved it. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. True story. So yeah, this is Bruce Schneier. I think you all know Bruce Schneier. So if you can include the Bruce Schneier quote and add some credibility to what you're saying. So he has called, I think about a decade ago, spam one of computer security success stories. So I'm going to talk about this success story. I'm going to explain that it's not about solving a problem, but about mitigating it. And I think we can learn a lot from this history. Are there any millennials in this room? So this is what a mail server used to look like. So in the early days, like 1990s or earlier, people used to send email this way. So you wrote an email on a piece of paper, you put the address on the envelope, and you brought it to the mail server, and it got delivered to the recipient. And that's more or less how regular mail worked. It's very similar to email. You send mail to anyone as long as you have their address. That's all you needed to have, and then of course a stamp. Email is the same, but very fast and at scale. Email works very similar. You still need to go to a local mail server. You don't deliver directly to someone's inbox. Your computer, your laptop, your phone can all be off and you still will receive email. Even if you don't use webmail, but you use some email at your ISP. So email is in many ways similar to regular mail, but it's faster and it scales better. And included in that is that it's cheaper. And spam is kind of the same. Spam is very fast, scalable. The only difference between spam and regular email is that spam is something we don't want. So maybe this is the core quote of my talk. Spam is not a bug. Spam is a feature of email. Spam is the only reason spam doesn't exist because people exploit some kind of CVE 1982-0001 vulnerability. Spam exists because people like to break the law, the rules, the often unwritten rules, although in many countries spam these days is somewhat illegal. As a consequence, there is no what anti-spam experts call final ultimate solution to the spam problem. So on an aside, I've just kind of implied at least that spam is not a solvable problem because it's inherent in email. So is malware solvable? Well, let's look at 3 widely used programs on a modern Windows system. There's Microsoft Outlook, which, as you know, sends emails. There's BitLocker, also happens to be from Microsoft, which encrypts your files and your disks. And there's Dropbox, which uploads files to a cloud server. There's also 3 kinds of malware. There's spam bots that send spam from your device. There's ransomware, which encrypts your files with a key that which you at least don't have the private key, and it steals your files. The 3 very common types of malware. Now, I'm not saying there's no way we can't distinguish them from Outlook and from legitimate file encryption, but at a very high level, they are similar. There is no objective way often to distinguish malware and legitimate programs. So the malware problem isn't completely solvable either. Now, you got people that start reading, that don't believe me about that spam is a part of email, and they start reading the RFCs that define email. And email is, especially if you look at it with today's eyes, email is an incredibly broken protocol. I mean, I can pretend to be Bill Gates and use Bill Gates' email address in the from field, and it is a legitimate email. It complies to the relevant RFCs. So there are people, and I've been one of them when I first started looking at spam, who think, hold on, we can just fix email. We can just solve the spam problem by fixing email. So spam is often defined as unsolicited bulk email. So one thing they do is, well, they try and solve the unsolicitedness problem. They decide, they find a way so that you can only accept email from people that you've previously approved. Now, one major problem with that is that it would be practically unworkable to build such a system because you need some kind of global approval system, probably some kind of key infrastructure. A second problem is that it kind of moves the problem of trusting a sender from the email level to the invitation level, to the interaction level. This is called the interaction problem. So rather than you get an email from someone who claims to be your bank, you get an invitation to accept future emails from someone who claims to be your bank. And if we can't solve the first problem, then we probably can't solve the second problem either. And it's also good to know that in modern email, you could probably use a whitelisting system if you really want to. You can just whitelist senders. I know senders are not properly authenticated, but in practice, with lots of mitigations that I'll mention later on, it probably works reasonably well. And I've known of people who've done this, but I think you really need a decent understanding of how email works. Otherwise, you constantly get emails from supposedly new senders when it just turns out that the company has changed its domain or started using a slightly different way of using email addresses in the company. People have also tried to solve the bulk problem of spam, of email. So they decided, well, what if we just made it a lot harder to send email? There are basically two ways to do that. One is a business side of things. So what if we just charge a little bit of money for email? So we charge 100 of a euro cent to send one email, which means that for anyone in this room, just use day-to-day business, we wouldn't even notice. But if you want to send millions of emails, which is something that spammers do, you wouldn't be able to afford it. A slightly related idea is a more technical approach where where the idea is that to send an email, you need to do some proof of work. You need to solve some cryptographic puzzle. Similar to what Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies do. And only then your email will be accepted. There's been many people who've looked at this, written papers on this, and the conclusion of all of these papers is this will not work. And there are many reasons for this, but one important reason is botnets. Spammers have access to botnets, so they have access to other people's money to pay for the emails they send, other people's computing resources. So this will not stop spam. It will only make it more likely that it gets accepted. And then finally, and maybe that is the most likely way you could solve spam, is by making email something else. If email were invented today, then people like me like to think if we would invent email today with a proper protocol with encryption, everything, and authentication, everything built in, I think that's not realistic. If email were to be invented today, it would be hosted by Facebook or some other company. In fact, Facebook, about 8 years ago, I think they tried to build some kind of email replacement. They tried to make Facebook Messenger the new email, and people were writing articles about the apparent death of email. Email is still around, as is Facebook, at least for the time being. But okay, privacy issues and creepiness and big business or whatever aside, from a security point of view, that would have been great, because Facebook would make sure that would prevent most of the kind of spam that is being sent now, because it requires some kind of scale. At least the volume would be much, much larger. It would also mean that spam would probably mostly send from compromised accounts, which means that it would become more credible. But at least our networks wouldn't be clogged and we wouldn't need spam filters. We just need to be a bit more careful. Maybe that would have been a better thing. And if you think this is the idea that Mark Zuckerberg decides who sends email and who doesn't, because you can also imagine that if Facebook were to decide who sends email, that they would block, more extremist organization, like the kinds that Facebook now blocks, often rightly, perhaps sometimes wrongly. And if you think that's scary, then keep in mind that on an iPhone, the main reason why there's barely any malware on iPhone is that Apple tightly controls the device. Apple controls what kind of apps there are in there. Google does to some extent with Android. Google is a lot more relaxed, and Google allows you to install apps from third-party stores. So yeah, and the iPhone, this works. I mean, I'm an open source person. I like the idea that everyone can do things themselves, but from a security point of view, this works. So why haven't we fixed email? Because I can see various things in at least in the protocol that can be fixed. Why are many ideas? Why? And I've seen great ideas. Why do they not work? Well, it's very simple. Email works. I spend a lot of my work time looking at spam, looking at malware sent via email, looking at all sorts of scams. There are a lot of things still going on in email that are bad. But also in my work, I use email to communicate with clients, to communicate with people that are conference I'm speaking, people speaking at our conference, that sort of thing. And for all these cases, email just works. False positives, like email being blocked, is a problem, but it's a very small problem. Some spam leak through. I know people lose money, etc. Sometimes a lot of money. I know companies have lost $60 million because of an email, but these are exceptions. In general, email works. And that's good to keep in mind. I mean, I'm not a big fan of connected devices because I'm not much of a gadget person. But when I think of the IoT, I think of IoT as a problem, as a security problem. As all these horrible devices that run in a 5-year-old, extremely vulnerable version of Linux, that everyone can hack and that allow you to hack your own house. When I talk to my relatives, to my non-security friends, they all have IoT devices. They have remotely controlled thermostats. They don't see it as a problem, and things don't go wrong generally. They see it as a fantastic way to be able to turn on the heating 15 minutes before they arrive home. So, why does email work despite the inherent spam problem? Well, two things. Firstly, we've thrown boxes at the problem, and secondly, we've put a bit of sellotape around the edges. So, I work for a company whose customers are security vendors. And still, I think a lot of security vendors, a lot of products, are probably overselling. They're trying to make the problem worse. There's this thing in marketing where 50% of marketing is pointless if we don't know which 50%. That's definitely true for security products, and it's probably a slightly higher percentage. But we shouldn't forget that security products also do solve problems. They do mitigate a lot of attacks, and spam is the most obvious example. I mean, once a month I have a discussion with people like Tavis Ormandy about whether you need antivirus. Always at an evening that I don't mean to, and my Twitter mentions blow up when Tavis starts arguing with me. I know very few people who would argue that you don't need a spam filter. And spam filter is throwing a box at the problem. So what kind of techniques do spam filters use? And I should say spam filter is often a multi-layered approach. There's outbound, there's inbound, there's some spam filtering at the endpoint, though most of it happens at the network. The most basic spam filtering and the early kind of spam filtering is Bayesian statistics. And Bayesian statistics is the very simple idea that basically you look at the words in the spam email and you look at how likely it is that these words, based on historic data, how likely these words appear in spam or in legitimate email, you calculate a probability. That's why, at least in the past, you quite often saw at the bottom of a spam email in very small print or in white text half the words of Shakespeare, hoping that they would bust filters. Filters have become pretty clever, and actually content filtering was a big thing in the early 2000s. There were actually serious spam or anti-spam conference. The MIT had a famous one. I think they've more or less died down. I think we kind of know that we can solve this problem reasonably well enough. Often someone comes with a nice new idea, but I haven't seen anything shocking. There are IP blacklists, which is, we all know, Spamhaus, SORPs, quite a few other organizations have these kind of blacklists. Basically list of bad senders, sometimes a list of IP addresses that you shouldn't send email because they're home IP ranges. And a slightly more advanced sender reputation, which is a slightly more subtle way, including domains and whatnot. And of course, there's scanning of attachments and links. And if you think that sounds all very 1990s, that's kind of true, but Bayesian statistics is a way of machine learning, and IP blacklists and reputation is threat intel. So they were cool long before these things were cool. And much as email is a broken protocol and we're still using it, we have fixed it in a number of ways. For example, in the early days of the internet, there were servers called open relays. The idea was a lot of servers, mail servers on the internet, they just weren't on all the time. So there were mail servers that accepted mail from anyone for anyone, and they would then pass it on, and then the relevant mail server was on, which is a fantastic way if you're a spammer to not get your IP address detected. These have been closed. These have been forced closed. I think, if I'm not some of the IP blacklists, at least, and I'm not sure if that's Spamhaus, they started as a list of open relays, and they basically, if you run an open relay, even by accident, and I know because I once did it for about 5 minutes, you can't send email. It wasn't a production mail server, but it took about 5 minutes before spammers found out. They were still looking for it about a decade ago. And once spammers find out, then all the blacklists going to blacklist you and you have a serious problem. So open relays, even if I'm not sure if they're technically allowed in practice, you can't use them. Port 25 is the SMTP port, the port for sending email. In general, it is, in many cases, it is closed for home users. As a home user, you cannot run a mail server. When I moved into, with the student accommodation where I lived in the early 2000s, was getting what is then really cool, fast cable, glass fiber internet. And one of the rules was, okay, we closed off port 25. There were people really upset, but because people were running mail servers from home. I don't think anyone would expect anything less. I don't think anyone these days would expect to be able to run a mail server from home. And of course, the reason why this is blocked, that a lot of people, when they run a mail server from home, they actually run, they don't mean to, they just run an infected Windows box, with some spam bots. And then there are SPF, DKIM, and DMARC, which you hear increasingly often. Very simply, SPF allows a domain owner to list all IP addresses used to send email. DKIM signs all outgoing emails, ties it to your domain. And DMARC is a way to say, well, if you receive an email from me, but it's not from one of my SPF allowed IP addresses, or it doesn't have a DKIM signature, here's what you need to do. And one of the cool things about it is also, you can tell people, tell me about it if you can see it, so you can solve your email delivery problems. So DMARC is one of these things that sound like a silver bullet, like, wow, that's cool. You can, basically DMARC in theory allows you to tell people to block emails pretending to come from you that didn't really come from you. The problem is that in practice, email works a bit more complicated than that. And there are legitimate ways for DKIM, so for DMARC to fail when the email is still from you. And there are very few companies right now that can afford to have a very strict DMARC policy. It doesn't mean that DMARC doesn't have function. I think it's one of the most successful protocols because it is so subtle. It just helps a little bit with the filtering of email. But there's one really great advantage if you're a security researcher, because you can easily scan which companies use DMARC. And you can write an angry blog post about lots of organizations not using DMARC. And like, none of local governments in Ireland use DMARC, or most small and medium-sized companies don't use DMARC, and it's terrible, or if they use it, they haven't said it properly. And there are lots of examples of this. And they're all, they're all, how to put it politely, rubbish. So I'm almost done. I can't talk about email without mentioning email encryption. So can I say something about email encryption? And the answer is, yeah, there is no problem. I mean, again, I have an EFF sticker on my laptop. I care about privacy. I care about encryption. I wish all emails were encrypted end to end, but they're not, and no one really seems to mind. And it is also very rare, because there is a lot of encryption taking place on the transport layer. It is also very rare that people's emails get intercepted on the wire or in some other way. If people's emails get hacked, it's usually at the endpoint, which means that end-to-end encryption is not going to help you very much unless you do it in such a way that they remain encrypted unless you physically log in, and then the key is immediately destroyed. So much as I would like encryption to be used more widely in email in practice, I don't see this happening. And it's a shame, because I've seen great protocols. I've seen a fantastic protocol called Darkmail, which is basically an email extension which was designed by people who really understood how people use email, but also understood encryption. It would really be able to be built on top of email without hurting the existing use of email, but that's not how it's going to work in practice. And finally, I'm going to say something about targeted email attacks. Can we stop them? No, we can't. And I think it's wrong to pretend, but there are a number of things that we can do. You can raise awareness I'm very skeptical about training it. Just tells people not to click on links because we all click on links. All of us send links in emails, hoping that the recipient clicks on it. So it's a bit silly to tell other people shouldn't click on links. Same with attachments. But still, raising awareness means that people will know that some emails are fake. Or maybe they just know that some emails are from the IT department and they don't want an embarrassing lecture. Assume that some emails will actually get through. So build a system like two-factor authentication and stuff like that. I don't know if there are any companies here, people here that offer such a service, but build defenses accordingly. Also, multi-layered approach. Just clicking a link shouldn't immediately give access to all your private data. There are products that do mitigate the risk of targeted email attacks, that do scan attachments. It just puts the bar a bit higher. That does help. And finally, something bad's going to happen. So do be ready to contact Mandiant about the investigation and keep looking at Brian Krebs's blog in case he mentions you. Okay, I think that's it. No, I'm sure that's it actually.